Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Kramer with MRC-TV. Today we're speaking with Hans von Spakovsky, an elections expert over at Heritage, to discuss HR 4. We're going to discuss what it is and how it's going to affect elections moving forward. Hans, thank you so much for joining.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So for starters, the claim is that HR 4 federalizes elections. How so? And why are those on the right calling it the Pelosi Power Grab Act?
Yeah, HR 4 is a really dangerous bill because what it does is it tells states all over the country that if they make certain changes in their election laws, those laws will not be effective until and unless they are first pre-approved and okayed by federal bureaucrats at the Department of Justice. So if a state, for example, puts in a voter ID law, if they change the rules for registering to vote, if they simply move a polling location, that won't be effective unless it's first pre-approved by the Justice Department. So it's a real invasion of state sovereignty. Plus, it's not as if the bureaucrats inside the office at Justice are nonpartisan objective individuals. They have a, unfortunately, notorious history for partisan behavior and political behavior in that particular office.
Now, obviously, the other side is saying that this bill will make elections safe and fair, but you and the right is obviously saying that it's going to be more chaotic and probably easier for voter fraud. Can you explain a little bit how that's so?
Sure. Look, the claims being made about the need for this bill are just untrue. You know, the left has been spreading this myth that there's this wave of voter suppression going on across the country. It has been for the past decade. That is simply not true. All you have to do is look at the latest voter registration and turnout numbers from last year's election, which reached record highs in many states, to see that there's no voter suppression going on. Second, there's no reason to amend the Voting Rights Act to bring this provision in, because the Voting Rights Act today, as it stands, has a very powerful provision in it. It's called Section 2, which bans racial discrimination in voting across the country. And if the Justice Department believes that a state is actually discriminating, they can simply go to court, make a Section 2 claim, and prove their case in court. What they want to do with this bill is negate the requirement to go to court, and like I said, just have federal bureaucrats deciding what the rule is going to be in each state.
How is HR 4 any different than the Democratic takeover of elections that was HR 1, which already failed earlier this year?
You know, HR 4, the difference between HR 4 and HR 1 is HR 1 came right out and said, we're banning things like voter ID laws across the states. What HR 4 does is it gives the veto authority to individuals in the Justice Department to basically say no to states passing things like voter ID laws. So for the foreseeable future, it would endanger elections because it would basically abrogate the ability of the voters of each state and their elected state representatives to decide what the rules are going to be for elections in their states.
Now, those on the right say that this would essentially nullify the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County versus Holder. Can you explain what happened in that court case and how this bill would challenge that decision?
Sure. Shelby County was a decision several years ago by the U.S. Supreme Court in which they said that one particular part of the Voting Rights Act could no longer be used. It was a provision that was supposed to be temporary. It was only supposed to last 5 years when it was first passed in 1965. And it basically said that a handful of states, places like Georgia, Alabama, and elsewhere, they could not make any changes in their voting laws because of the active, widespread, systematic discrimination being practiced in those states against black voters. They could not make any changes in their voting laws without first getting the pre-approval of the Justice Department. Well, in 2013, the Supreme Court said, look, Section 5 is no longer applicable because there's no longer any systematic, widespread discrimination. And so there's no reason to keep special mother may I provisions in place for states like Georgia and Alabama, particularly when you look at the fact that black voters there now register and turn out often at the same rates as whites, and in some states even higher than white voters. So there simply was no justification for Section 5 anymore and the pre-approval process.
So you need an ID to accompany your vaccination card in New York City, but you don't need an ID to vote in certain states, or at least that's what Democrats are pushing. Is it not racist to now ask for an ID when it comes to COVID? Seems like there's a double standard there.
Yeah, that really shows the hypocrisy of the left. They are absolutely against voter ID laws. They say it somehow suppresses votes, keeps people from voting, and yet New York City, which doesn't require an ID to vote, is saying, well, you have to show an ID, for vaccinations and things like that. It really shows you that their claims about voter ID are simply not true. They apparently just want to make it easy to cheat in elections. What other reason could you possibly have for being against voter ID when the overwhelming majority of Americans already have an ID, and every single state that's put in an ID requirement has put in a provision saying, look, if you don't already have an ID, we'll provide one to you for free.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully this will then work for our arguments for pushing voter ID so that there's less and less fraud in our elections. Thank you, Hans, so much for your expertise. I really appreciate it.